Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 42 in my ongoing series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. I premise every episode by saying that these episodes are designed to stand on their own to the extent possible, meaning I hope you can listen to each one and get something out of it, even if you haven't listened to all the previous episodes yet. On the other hand, it is still part of a series, and I believe this story is even better and more interesting when understood in its full context. So if you find yourself getting lost and you want more context, that can usually be found in the previous episodes. Last time, on the History Sphere, I completed my telling of the Eastern Bloc revolutions of 1989 with an account of the Romanian Revolution of 1989. Next, I will circle back to the USSR and begin a series of episodes on the events in some of the non-Russian republics, starting with a look at the Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I will start that process today with a very broad overview of the Baltic states and their history up to the 1980s. This is The End of History, Part 42. Having grown up and come of age in a post-Cold War world, the idea of a major conflict in Europe seemed for most of my life to be incredibly remote. War, of course, has been prolific around the globe for the last 35 years, but as an American separated by oceans from much of the world, those conflicts, even the ones in which my own country took part, always seemed distant. Don't get me wrong, I deeply cared about those conflicts and even actively protested against some of them. But I've been fortunate enough to live my life in a world where my day-to-day life was not affected by war or the threat of war. The idea that the United States might be drawn into a conflict with other major powers and be forced to struggle for its own national survival was beyond unlikely. When I traveled to Russia and spent time there during the early 2010s, Russia didn't feel like an enemy nation. Sure, there were disagreements between Russia and the West, even violent ones, such as the August 2008 war with Georgia. But that didn't prevent me from freely traveling to, living, and studying in Russia. They were, in many respects, a partner, an integrated part of the modern world order. I never felt during my time there that I was living in anything approaching a dystopian, authoritarian society. The signs were there, of course, particularly in the veiled assassinations of Putin's political rivals and aggression against neighbors like Georgia, but those political repressions and aggressions were limited in scope. Putin, I thought, was more than willing to rock the boat, but he was still a rational actor. He wasn't going to tip the boat over. If I had to sum up my experience in Russia succinctly, I would describe it as a normal place where normal people live normal lives. Even when Russia occupied and annexed Crimea in 2014, I was concerned as a person who loves Russians and wants to see them live in a free society integrated with the wider democratic world, but I still thought it was unlikely to upset the global balance of power or make a world war more likely. Then, in 2022, Putin capsized the boat. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine shocked me. Even as the Biden administration leaked intelligence that seemed to show an invasion was imminent, I was not convinced it would actually happen until Russian troops poured across the border. I always understood that Putin's regime was unhappy with the post-Cold War world order, but I had always concluded that Putin wanted Russia to establish its place within that order, not that he wanted to destroy it. Events since 2022 have proven me wrong. He has no use for the old world order. He wants a new one, and Ukraine is his testing ground. As much as I love Russia and my Russian friends, I have been a strong supporter of Ukraine from the start because I love peace and international law more than I love Russia. Putin made an initial miscalculation, underestimating the will of the Ukrainians to resist and the effectiveness of their armed forces, especially with Western support. But in the long run, He seems to have calculated that the West would falter and lose the will to continue supporting Ukraine's right to sovereignty, and that Russia would eventually grind down Ukraine and prevail in a war of attrition. As of the recording of this episode in May 2025, that calculation appears to be correct. The US is sinking into isolationism in a way not seen since the 1920s and 30s, and the political will to support Ukraine is drying up, as American politics turns inwards towards its own struggle with nationalism and authoritarianism. I hope I'm wrong, but it appears increasingly likely that Russia will prevail in Ukraine. Putin is going to get away with it. The question is what comes next. And one of my greatest fears is that the answer to that question is the Baltic states. The ideology of Putin's Russia does not stop with dominating Ukraine, but extends to the entire near abroad, which includes more or less all of the former Soviet states. Putin gambled when he invaded Ukraine. He bet that the West would not fight for Ukraine and would quickly lose the will to support them. Now, with the current US administration exposing the cracks in the foundation of the NATO alliance, might he be willing to let his winning streak ride and test that foundation? If Putin believes that the United States and Europe will be unwilling to risk nuclear war with Russia to defend Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, I think it's at least possible. These Baltic states are unique in several ways, but first and foremost, they are the only former Soviet republics that have been fully integrated into the NATO alliance, joining in 2004, as well as the European Union. By treaty, the United States and the rest of NATO would be obligated to come to their defense if they were attacked. In the past, I would have been confident that Putin would never risk so rash an action. But today, especially if the United States continues to undermine the cohesiveness of NATO and pull away from our European allies, it's not unthinkable that he will call NATO's bluff. It doesn't help that these states, especially Estonia and Latvia, are fiercely nationalistic and home to large ethnic Russian populations, many of whom have been relegated to the status of second-class citizens. Of the three Baltic states, only Lithuania extended citizenship to all its residents upon independence in 1991. In both Estonia and Latvia, those who immigrated after the illegal Soviet occupation and annexation of 1940 and their descendants, mostly Russians, were not automatically extended citizenship, but are instead given a status of residency without citizenship. In order to naturalize in either country, these residents must complete a rigorous process which includes a demonstration of mastery of the national language, something that, especially in Estonia, where the national language is notoriously difficult for non-native speakers to master, many, especially older Russians, have been unable to do. The governments of Estonia and Latvia have drawn criticism for this state of affairs, as some human rights advocates have declared that it renders much of the Baltic Russian population stateless. Estonian and Latvian legal experts who defend their citizenship laws point out, I think correctly, that the occupation and annexation of their countries by the USSR from 1940 to 1991 was illegal under international law, and it was therefore illegal for the USSR to transfer ethnic Russians to the Baltic states in order to Sovietize them. They further argue, I think with less credibility, that the modern independent states of Estonia and Latvia are not new states, but merely resumed the independence as the same independent states that existed on the territory from 1920 to 1940. The Russians who entered their territory illegally during the years of occupation, therefore, have no right to citizenship. While I understand these arguments and even acknowledge their merit from a legal perspective, from a practical perspective, you can count me among the critics of the restrictive approach to citizenship taken by Estonia and Latvia. Not only because as a relatively liberal-minded American, I have much more sympathy for pluralistic societies than I do for nationalistic ones, but also because I think that this plays right into the hands of Kremlin propagandists. Surveys of the Baltic Russian population consistently show that the vast majority of Baltic Russians don't have any particular loyalty or affinity for the modern Russian state, most of them having been born and lived their entire lives in the Baltic states. and the Baltic Russians have formed their own unique national identities as a diasporic community, completely independent of the Kremlin. And yet, by denying many of them the full rights of citizenship, these states have allowed an opening for Kremlin propaganda to push a narrative to Russian nationalists about a persecuted Russian minority and to position Putin's Russia as their de facto protector. Those of you who have followed the war in Ukraine over the last several years will probably recognize this all too familiar talking point and justification for Russian action. If a war were to break out in Europe between Russia and NATO, I think it would almost certainly start in the Baltic. These three tiny countries, therefore, are among the most important in the world to understand, and yet they are often overlooked and glossed over by historians of the Soviet period. A lot of people who study the Soviet period, and I'll go ahead and count myself in this category, tend to focus a lot on Russia and gloss over events in the other republics as relevant but peripheral to the really important events happening in Moscow. As the smallest and least populous of all the Soviet republics, the Baltic states get it even worse than the others. And yet, in my research for this series, I have come to the conclusion that events in the Baltic are one of the linchpins for understanding how and why the USSR fell apart, as well as the geopolitical situation we inherited from that disintegration. And for that reason, I think it's important to take a step back and really dig into the history and identities of the Baltic states. Latvians and Lithuanians speak closely related languages. Experts estimate that they likely split into separate languages sometime in the early Middle Ages, which are both Indo-European languages. Estonians come from a different lineage, speaking a Finno-Ugric language, which is not Indo-European and is closely related to Finnish and somewhat less closely related to Hungarian. The Baltic was the last region of Europe to Christianize, maintaining their traditional pagan religious practices well into the 14th century. While the rulers and nobles of the Baltic peoples were all Christian by the end of the 14th century, pagan practices and traditions would continue among the common people well into the 17th century, long after they had been extinguished elsewhere in Europe. In the late Middle Ages, Lithuania rose to become one of the great empires of Europe, eventually ruling over vast portions of what is today Eastern Europe, and it was one of the main antagonists of the early Russian states during this period, with the Lithuanians usually having the upper hand. Latvia and Estonia, on the other hand, whose rulers resisted Christianization, became the target of what is now known as the Northern Crusade, in which mostly German and Danish crusaders invaded and forcibly Christianized the Latvian and Estonian peoples at the point of a sword. As a reward for their service to the Church, these crusaders became the new feudal overlords of the Baltic territories, and their descendants became the Baltic German nobility, who would form the ruling class in Estonia and Latvia for centuries. Under the rule of the Baltic Germans, the Latvian and Estonian languages were spoken mostly by peasants, and the dominant language of the elite was German. During the Protestant Reformation, the Baltic Germans mostly embraced Lutheranism, and their subjects tended to follow suit, with Protestantism becoming the dominant faith in Latvia and Estonia. Lithuania, on the other hand, remained loyal to the Catholic Church, and Catholicism remains the dominant faith in Lithuania today. The first large numbers of Russians settled in the region in the mid-17th century, following a schism in the Russian Orthodox Church, resulting from the liturgical reforms of Patriarch Nikon of Moscow. Those who rejected the reforms, known as staroveri, or Old Believers, were excommunicated and persecuted, leading them to seek refuge in remote regions of Russia and in neighboring countries, including the Baltics. Though they were decimated by the religious persecutions of the Soviet period, communities of Old Believers continue to exist in Latvia and Estonia to this day. The Baltics first came under Russian rule in 1710, following the victory of Peter the Great over Sweden in the Great Northern War. For average inhabitants of the region, however, Russian rule did not change much. Peter the Great loved all things Western, and was eager to incorporate the Baltic German nobility into his own bureaucracy in the hope that their presence would influence the Russian nobility to become more Westernized. The Baltic German ruling class continued to administer the region as they had before the Russian conquest. German remained the primary language and Lutheranism the dominant faith. The Baltic German nobility would come to have an outsized impact on the history of Imperial Russia, with many of its members comprising the elite military commanders, becoming close advisors of Peter and his successors. Lithuania in the late Middle Ages entered a union with Poland, first by mere personal union, meaning Poland and Lithuania were politically separate states sharing the same monarch, and later merging with Poland to form a unified state, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was among the largest states in Europe at the time. Union with Poland resulted in Polish overtaking Lithuanian as the dominant language of the Lithuanian nobility. So like in Estonia and Latvia, where the noble class spoke German, in Lithuania the nobility spoke Polish, and largely viewed the Lithuanian language as the unrefined language of peasants. The land comprising modern-day Lithuania came under Russian imperial rule in 1795, when what was left of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was partitioned and divided up between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Unlike in Estonia and Latvia, where Peter the Great had incorporated the local nobility and allowed political life to continue relatively uninterrupted, in Lithuania, Catherine the Great and her successors imposed a much more direct and authoritarian imperial rule. Lithuania was ruled as a province by governors appointed directly from St. Petersburg, though through the first half of the 19th century, few attempts were made to quote-unquote Russify the population. By the 1860s, however, in all three Baltic regions, as everywhere else in Europe, nationalism became a dominant ideological force. To many today, it seems a very natural thing that the state is an entity formed around people with shared ethnic or linguistic ties. Basically, the idea that people of similar background who speak the same language should be part of the same state or have their own state. But it's important to understand that prior to the 19th century, this was not the primary foundation upon which states were created and perpetuated. People, of course, understood the concept of nationality and even recognized a kinship with people who spoke the same language, but it just wasn't how the boundaries of states were drawn. From the fall of the Roman Empire until the 19th century, most of Europe operated on some version of the feudal system, wherein the state was formed around personal loyalty rather than loyalty to the state itself. The high nobility swore allegiance to a king, lower nobility swore allegiance to the high nobility, and common people everywhere swore loyalty and owed labor or service to their local lord. It was not at all uncommon for a lord of one nationality to owe allegiance to a king of a different nationality. That all changed with the French Revolution, when the largest, most powerful country in Europe abolished monarchy and overturned the entire feudal system. The basis of the legitimacy of the revolutionary government came to center on the nation. Rather than loyalty to any individual, one's loyalty was to France and the French people. When Napoleon marched his armies across Europe, he took these ideas with him, and despite the defeat of Napoleon, by the latter half of the 19th century, nationalism was one of the dominant ideologies in Europe, affecting common people of subject nations as well as monarchs of great powers. So, just as nationalist movements were awakening in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, ideas of Russian nationalism permeated the ruling elite of the imperial capital in St. Petersburg, leading to a policy of Russification. Local languages were suppressed, and the populations were encouraged to learn Russian. Even when Tsar Alexander II instituted sweeping liberalizing reforms, areas of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, including Lithuania, were excluded from the reforms, and Russian authorities clamped down hard on any dissent. This in turn only further strengthened nationalist sentiment, and was partially responsible for a national uprising in Lithuania and in Poland in January 1864. The January uprising was crushed, and in its aftermath, publishing in the Lithuanian language was outlawed, and universities such as the University of Vilnius, where the language of instruction was Lithuanian or Polish, were closed. There were no grand national uprisings in Estonia or Latvia, but rather a slow but steady national awakening, where Estonians and Latvians published great epics in their national languages and developed distinct, national identities. Russification was not initially pushed in Latvia or Estonia like it was in Lithuania, and the semi-autonomous German nobility of the region was heavily influenced by Enlightenment ideas. Much of the Baltic German nobility not only permitted but even encouraged the cultural flowering that flowed from Estonia and Latvia's national awakenings. This intellectual golden age came to an end in the 1880s when a new Tsar, Alexander III, came to the throne in St. Petersburg. Alexander, likely influenced by the assassination of his relatively liberal father, Alexander II, was in many ways the polar opposite of his father. He was a deeply reactionary figure. He believed in autocracy, orthodoxy, and Russian nationalism. This was the Russian Empire, and as far as Alexander III was concerned, subject nations like the Baltic peoples just lived in it. Russification was extended to Estonia and Latvia, and the German nobility in the region lost much of their autonomy. Alexander stopped short of trying to officially suppress Protestantism or Catholicism in parts of the empire where they were predominant, but conversion to Orthodoxy was encouraged, as were other gestures of assimilation with the Russian majority. Alexander III also hoped to quell nationalist sentiment in the Baltics and elsewhere by rallying non-Russian people against a common enemy that was not Russia. That enemy, as it so often has been throughout history, was of course the Jews. Alexander III's government spearheaded a massive campaign of anti-Semitic propaganda and tacitly encouraged a series of pogroms against Jewish communities. The 1880s and 1890s saw a spike in violence against Jews in the Russian Empire, and a corresponding spike in emigration of Jews, largely to the United States. The pogroms eventually died down, but anti-Semitic undercurrents remained in the societies of Eastern Europe, where they were encouraged by the Russian imperial authorities. It's also worth noting that Alexander III is deeply admired by the leader of modern Russia, Vladimir Putin, along with Stalin, Peter the Great, and Ivan the Terrible. Take from that what you will. The Russian Revolution, which I covered in some detail back in episodes 2 and 3 for anyone who wants a refresher, had a profound impact on the Baltic region. Prior to 1917, nationalist movements in the Baltic were primarily focused on autonomy for their countries within the Russian Empire, and few even dared to dream of total independence. This was indeed the great hope of many Baltic nationalists after the February Revolution, that the Baltic states would become autonomous republics in a confederation with a new democratic Russia. The October Revolution and the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks changed all that. The Baltics were still mostly rural agrarian societies in 1917, and there were few communists. Among Estonians, the Bolsheviks had virtually no support, even in urban areas. In Latvia, the Bolsheviks won 41% of the vote in a municipal election in Riga, and though they never held support of a majority, there were plenty of communists in Latvia. The famed Red Latvian Rifles were a key part of the Red Army's victory in the Russian Civil War, and they brought that war back to Latvia with them when they attempted to impose Bolshevik rule. In Latvia, at least, the war for independence was also very much a civil war. With support from British, French, American, and even German forces, nationalists in all three Baltic states formed governments, raised armies, and pushed the Bolsheviks out, establishing independence. Beleaguered by the advance of the White armies on other fronts and fearing for the future of the regime, Lenin bought himself some time and breathing space by signing peace treaties with the Baltic governments, recognizing their independence. A number of the Bolsheviks, notably Stalin, opposed this move, but it did accomplish Lenin's short-term goal of freeing up Red Army forces, including the Latvian Rifles who remained loyal to the Bolsheviks even after independence, to move to other fronts and defeat the White armies. By the summer of 1920, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia had all established internationally recognized governments. All three governments were democracies influenced as they were by the post-World War I optimism of the day. But the fact that they adopted democratic constitutions did not exempt the Baltic states from the influence of more sinister ideologies that were prevalent throughout Europe in the 1920s and 30s, and I'm talking, of course, about fascism. Today, fascism is a dirty word pretty much anywhere in the world. The connotations of that word are so negative among common people that today, even political parties that hold what, in my opinion, are clearly fascist ideologies vigorously deny the charge, and they usually accuse their opponents of being the real fascists. But in the late 1920s, and especially by the 1930s, with the coming of the Great Depression, fascism was one of the dominant ideologies on the European continent. By the mid 1930s, fascist or quasi fascist states were at least as common as liberal democracies. Most histories focus on fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, but it's important to point out that Hungary, Romania, and Spain all had arguably fascist governments at that time as well. I say arguably because one of the sticky points of fascism is that it is notoriously difficult to define, because unlike communism, for example, where there is an explicit published core ideology, fascism takes different forms depending on where it pops up. For my purposes, I will define fascism as a radical, right-wing, reactionary, nationalist, and authoritarian government, where opposition is suppressed, the rule of law is held in contempt, and human rights are routinely violated. Important aspects of the ideology usually include ethnic or nationalist supremacy, combined with a victim mentality, and the identification of at least one class of enemies as a unifying cause. Basically, the fascist mindset is that we are the greatest, strongest people on the planet, but we're victims of Group X, who are preventing us from reaching our full national potential. Therefore, we must come together to eliminate Group X, so that our nation may assume its rightful place as the greatest on the planet. Group X often includes, but does not necessarily include in every case, Jews, journalists, lawyers, and above all, communists and socialists, who are often lumped in with left of center liberals, as fascism is also prone to black and white thinking. Fascism can be difficult to define and identify because it exists on a spectrum, and the line between a reactionary conservative government and a fascist government is often blurry. Francisco Franco's Spain is a good example of how this line can be blurred. Franco is often labeled as a fascist. He certainly had the support of outright fascists like Hitler and Mussolini, and he was definitely a right-wing authoritarian. So there were aspects of his regime that looked stereotypically fascist. Personally, however, I think that Franco took dictatorial powers because he believed it necessary to preserve the old order from the encroachment of left-wing forces. But his motivation was not to create a new, revolutionary right-wing order. In my mind, that makes him more of a reactionary conservative than a fascist. But there's certainly a lot of gray area. I bring all this up because the governments of the Baltic states in the interwar period also fell somewhere in this gray area. Stalin apologists on the authoritarian left will frequently label these governments as fascist in an attempt to justify the invasion and occupation of the Baltic states by Stalin in 1940. They're not entirely wrong. They're not right either. In Lithuania, for example, the president turned dictator Antanas Smetona embraced a very conservative nationalist ideology and suppressed his political opponents. At the same time, however, he vehemently rejected racial ideology. He explicitly rejected Hitler and the Nazis, and he had many Jewish supporters. In Estonia, at the same time, the regime was arguably based on right-wing authoritarian anti-fascism. Estonia did have an outright fascist movement that was heavily influenced by Nazi Germany and other fascist parties around Europe, the League of Veterans of the War of Independence, often shortened to just the League. In municipal elections in January 1934, the League won outright majorities in Estonia's three largest cities. Believing that if the fascists were allowed to continue unchecked, they would come to power through the democratic process as they had in Germany the year before, Estonia's conservative nationalist prime minister, Konstantin Pats, with the support of the military, staged a coup in March 1934 to prevent this outcome. Pats declared martial law and ruled by decree. Fearing the fascists and seeing Pats as the lesser of evils, a lot of Estonian leftists actually supported the coup. They were disappointed the following year when, in 1935, Pats dissolved parliament entirely and banned all political parties aside from his newly formed Fatherland League. Opposition figures were arrested, and the government relied on exclusionary ethnic nationalism as the basis of its legitimacy. Events followed an almost identical course in Latvia, where the conservative Prime Minister Karlis Ulmanis seized power in March 1934 to head off what he believed was an inevitable seizure of power by Latvia's outright fascist parties. Ulmanis surrounded his government in the many trappings of fascism, often repeating the rallying cry of Latvia for Latvians, and his rhetoric often targeted Latvia's Jewish minority, scapegoating them for problems in the country. His rhetoric also sometimes targeted and ostracized Latvia's Baltic German minority. Despite the rhetoric, however, there were no official persecutions endorsed by the government, and no explicitly anti-Semitic or racist laws were enacted during Ulmanis' dictatorship. Those of you who have been listening to the podcast for a while probably remember that all the way back in episode 6 I talked about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany divided Eastern Europe between them, with Germany ceding the Baltics to the Soviet sphere of influence. In the summer of 1940, the USSR sent ultimatums to all three Baltic states, using security against the threat from Nazi Germany as the excuse, demanding that all three Baltic states enter alliance with the Soviets and submit to the presence of Soviet troops on their territories. All three countries' governments ultimately gave in. After the fall of France in June 1940, Britain stood alone and was beleaguered by the Nazis, while America, an ocean away to begin with, remained mired in isolationism. There was simply no hope of assistance from the West, and Germany was nominally allied with the USSR at that time. It was clear that if they chose resistance, nobody would come to their aid. It was also clear that these three tiny countries did not stand a chance against the vast Red Army. In Lithuania, Smetona attempted to rally his people to resist, but he was ousted by his own government and forced to flee to the United States, where he died in obscurity 4 years later. After being allowed into the Baltic states, Soviet forces rapidly seized control of the governments and held sham elections in which all candidates were handpicked by the Soviets. The new governments that were elected quickly applied for admission as republics to the USSR, and they were formally annexed to the Soviet Union in July 1940. If this sounds at all familiar, Vladimir Putin applied a very similar tactic in holding referendums on joining Russia, first in Crimea and then in the eastern regions of Ukraine. With the Soviet occupation of the Baltics came the Stalinist repressions that had already been seen in the previous decade throughout the Soviet Union. The arrest and deportation of dissidents, collectivization of agriculture, and food confiscation to fuel rapid urban industrialization. This process of consolidation was still incomplete in June 1941, when Nazi Germany suddenly attacked the Soviet Union. When the Germans occupied the Baltic, having so recently lost their independence, quite a lot of Baltic people greeted them as liberators. The Nazis exploited pre-existing anti-Semitic undercurrents in Baltic societies, equating Jews with Soviet communism, and induced many locals to assist them in rounding up and murdering thousands of Jews in the Baltic states. The Jewish population in the Baltic states never recovered from these massacres. Support for the Germans was by no means universal, as many rightly saw them as just another oppressor, with no intention of supporting Baltic independence. That said, the Germans found no shortage of willing partners in the Baltic states, especially in the two northern states, where SS battalions were raised from volunteers in both Estonia and Latvia. Similar attempts to raise SS troops from Lithuania failed. Collaboration with the crimes against humanity committed by the Nazis should not define how we view the modern Baltic republics, but it is an inescapable fact of their history that these nations have not really reckoned with. There were plenty of Baltic people who refused cooperation with either the Germans or the Soviets, and there were even some, mostly dedicated communists, who actively supported the Red Army. This history is not simple. It's not black and white, it's filled with gray. Those who helped the Nazis to round up and murder Jews were unequivocally evil, and I have no problem condemning them. But the vast majority of people in the Baltic states were ordinary people caught up in a brutal struggle between two totalitarian regimes. There were no easy choices for them. As the Red Army swept back into the Baltic in 1944 and 1945, most people were utterly exhausted by war and were ready to accept peace at almost any price, even if that meant acquiescence to Soviet occupation. But there were some who refused. Taking to the remote forests of the Baltic, resistance groups who came to be known as the Forest Brothers continued to resist Soviet rule long after the guns fell silent elsewhere in Europe. Their hope was that war would break out between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, and they would then provide an army operating against Soviet supply lines in that war. But such a war never came about. The last resistance groups did not emerge from the forest to surrender until 1957. The death of Stalin in 1953 brought an end to the worst of the Soviet repressions in the Baltic, as it did elsewhere in the USSR. Khrushchev and his successors were far less interested in forcing Russification on the Baltic peoples, and Soviet propaganda even celebrated the Baltic national identities as brother nations and put them forward as an example of the internationalist bona fides of Soviet communism. Dissent was still not tolerated, and anyone advocating for independence or opposing communism was dealt with harshly. But as elsewhere in the USSR, the material conditions of life improved, and people who kept their political opinions to themselves could generally expect to live ordinary lives. The Baltic republics were rapidly urbanized and industrialized, and part of this process involved the immigration of hundreds of thousands of people from elsewhere in the Soviet Union to fill factory jobs in cities like Riga and Tallinn. The presence of these Russians was resented by many, who lamented the changing character of the country. One Estonian remembered, quote, "Our district was increasingly inhabited by Russian immigrants. Russian was spoken in the trams and shops. The shop windows were decorated in a Russian style which was alien to us, and which I utterly detested. In the shops, if I spoke my native language, the shop assistants yelled at me, and if I sent my son to a shop, he came back empty-handed because he spoke no Russian." End quote. Despite discontent with Soviet rule by many, the Baltics were relatively wealthy compared to much of the rest of the USSR, and the standard of living there was moderately higher. In the 1960s and 70s, the Baltic republics were often referred to as the Soviet West. Though they were the smallest republics in the USSR, the Baltic republics all contributed disproportionately to the national GDP, and a relatively massive portion of Soviet consumer products were manufactured there. Things like televisions, toasters, and other household appliances and electronics were largely manufactured in the Baltic states. As a result, these things were often more readily available in the Baltic than they were elsewhere in the Soviet Union. One interesting byproduct of this is the absurd commercials for available products in Soviet Estonia. I sometimes like to watch Soviet Estonian TV commercials on YouTube just for entertainment because they're so weird. If you're as weird as me, you might like them too. This relative economic prosperity did not entirely shield the Baltics from the economic hardships that emerged across the entire communist world in the 1980s. I've talked about this economic decline ad nauseum in previous episodes, so I'll just recap here by pointing out that the decline in value of certain commodities, like crude oil, combined with the failure of centrally planned economies to meet the demands of the service economy, caused hyperinflation, shortages of consumer goods, and general economic decline. Nationalist discontent was further fueled by economic hardship and a desire to integrate economically with the capitalist West. Finally, with the coming of perestroika, the lid was lifted off this simmering pot. People were allowed to openly discuss the crimes of the communist regime, express nationalist ideologies, and criticize the Soviet government. And in the Baltics, more than anywhere else in the Soviet Union, that is precisely what people did. By the late 1980s, the combination of all these factors was breeding new independence movements in the Baltic states, and that movement toward independence will be the subject of my next episode. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. As always, a very special thank you to my patrons who support the show with monthly donations on Patreon. If you appreciate what I do and you want to support the show, you can become a patron at patreon.com/historyspherepodcast. If you can't afford to become a patron right now, I get it. Times are hard everywhere. You can also support the show by giving it a 5-star rating on your podcast platform of choice, subscribing, and by telling your friends about us. If you're listening on Spotify, you can even leave a comment directly on the episode, and I encourage you to do that. Ask me a question, correct a mistake, or just tell me what you thought of the episode. More engagement helps to promote the show in the algorithm and introduce it to new listeners, so all of your input is greatly appreciated. Links to the Patreon, the show's social media pages, and all of my streaming platforms can be found on the show's website at www.thehistorysphere.com. On that website, you will also find a list of my sources for this episode. That website again is www.thehistorysphere.com. Next time on The History Sphere, I will cover the movement towards independence in the Baltic states as we move ever closer to the endgame for the entire USSR. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.